So Keir Starmer has come under fire from the Tories after saying he keeps Friday nights free for his family. Is this such a bad thing for a Prime Minister? How much impact will the issues with postal voting have on the outcome of the election, and will it lead to some changes? And reform are in hot water again over candidate defection and selection. Should the country be worried about some potential MPs? I'm Lorna Hughes, and joining me today is John Ferguson and Douglas Dickie. This is Planet Holyrood.
It's important we look at the facts.
Politics has to be about service.
A modern form of national service.
The outcome, that's for the voters to decide.
Okay, so Starmer's coming under increased attacks from the Tory party about his working hours and being with his children after 6 p.m. on a Friday. So he kind of gave a recap as to what he actually said. He's clearly been doing this for some time. He said that I've been doing this for years. I will not do a work-related thing after 6 o'clock. Pretty well come what may. There are a few exceptions, but that's what we do. So it does appear that barring a major incident, if he is elected, he will deal with that on a Friday. But isn't this quite a good rule for a future PM to have, Douglas?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I don't know if it was the brightest thing for him to say, to kind of reveal it at this stage of the election campaign. People want to believe that their PM is kind of available 24/7, and this has maybe opened them up to accusations that perhaps he won't be available 24/7, and that politics stops at 6 p.m. on a Friday. We know ourselves as journalists, the news doesn't stop at 5 p.m. Monday to Friday, and you've always got to be prepared to kind of jump on. But well, I'm not going to be a hypocrite about this one. I was always quite critical during COVID of the way that kind of Nicola Sturgeon worked every single day, and she kind of boasted about that. And I actually thought, rather than a sign of strength, I thought there was a wee sign of weakness there. It was someone who didn't trust her team. It was somebody who didn't know when to say when. And people who are tired and burnt out make bad decisions. And so I think it's, politicians, we kind of separate them from normal people, without we suggest that they're not normal, but I think we kind of put them in this pedestal where we expect them to be switched on constantly. And in many ways, they've kind of cultivated that image of themselves. But I don't think it's a massive issue going forward. Keir Starmer's almost certainly going to be Prime Minister come Friday. He'll celebrate up till 6 o'clock, I'm sure, then he'll stop. But I don't think it was very advisable for him to say it, because it's opened up another attack line for the Tories. But I feel like a broken record here. I don't think it's going to make any difference at all come Thursday.
I actually think that some people might actually quite like that, because I mean, he's proven. I don't think you could call him work shy. I don't think he's going to be running to Chequers as fast as possible, a bit like a former incumbent of number 10. I don't think I think he's going to read his briefing papers properly and understand. So I think the public might quite like that. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Previous incumbents in the number 10 have David Cameron, who notoriously liked to chillax whenever he got the chance, and Boris Johnson clearly was a fairly work-shy Prime Minister. I don't think I've ever heard any of those kind of accusations levelled against Keir Starmer. I mean, there are things that you could criticise, you could question the way that he seems to have been pandering to the right wing of his party and other parties. You could question the amount of detail in some of his policies. I've not really heard anyone criticising his work ethic. Everything I've heard of, certainly from contacts within the party, have told me that he's a very diligent guy. He turns up early, he works, and then he goes home to his family. He doesn't bother with the sort of socialising around Whitehall and Westminster. I suspect that's really what he means by this. I think I would be surprised if Keir Starmer's genuinely going to be able to, turn off his phone and not communicate again with his office as Prime Minister between 6 o'clock on a Friday and 9 on Monday morning. But yeah, I think I don't think it's going to make any difference to the outcome. And I think you're right. There are a lot of people who will like the idea of a Prime Minister who understands the value of work-life balance, understands the value of family and spending time with children, and then, coming back to work refreshed after the weekend. It's something that a lot of people would probably like to have in their own working week, including a lot of us. So,
and he's going to, round the dinner table on a Friday night, his wife works in the NHS, and obviously his children, go to state schools. So he's going to actually probably learn a wee bit about what is going on in the real world, which might not be a bad thing, rather than from a government advisor. I mean, Douglas is right that, Sturgeon was, I think, it's absolutely fair to say she worked, every hour that she possibly could. And, as we now know, the outcomes sadly weren't greater or better in Scotland during COVID. And, there is an argument about what there happened after. It doesn't mean that, you are the best leader if you're putting in a 20-hour day. Perhaps all this nonsense started from Margaret Thatcher and her I'll only sleep 4 hours a night. But I just think you're a better, well-rounded person.
I wonder as well if Labour weren't 21 points ahead in the polls, whether such a big deal would be made of this. If you're kind of looking at from the outside, is there a hint of desperation that this has been kind of leapt on? Because right now, the Tories are in desperate straits. There's absolutely no doubt about this. They're facing an existential crisis in the shape of reform, and they're going to take an absolute doing on Thursday, and they're maybe kind of clinging to anything, anything they can get their hands on.
I think that's absolutely right. I saw some people have said, "Oh well, if he finishes work at Friday at 6 o'clock, what about that beer that he had during lockdown through a window?" It does smack of desperation that they really are going for anything that they might think will damage Labour's prospects now, and I don't think it's going to work.
No, and interesting, Rishi Sunak, who's obviously been about today and had a wee trip to McDonald's, which and what was it he said, Dougie? Tell me.
Yeah, I actually thought he put out quite a good funny tweet earlier. I think it was a couple of years ago. He was asked what his favourite McDonald's meal was, and he picked a breakfast wrap that had happened to be off the menu for 2 years. He obviously doesn't go to McDonald's very often. Now, I'm a former McDonald's employee, so I always love talking it up. But he was back at McDonald's today, and he did get his hands on his breakfast wrap. It's made a comeback, and as he tweeted, he's a big fan of comebacks, and I think that's a wee nod towards Thursday as well. He obviously still thinks he can perform. Perform what would be a political miracle, obviously. But I thought that was quite a nice tweet from him. He's not often maybe known for his sense of humour, but I thought that was quite a good one.
If it was him, it wasn't.
Sort of like when he didn't know how to fill up his car with petrol and all that. I don't get the impression Rishi Sunak's spending that much time in his local McDonald's.
Well, he should. And breakfast and McDonald's for me are breakfast things. I'm not as big a fan as a Big Macs and whatnot, but when I worked there, I always loved the breakfast shift, so I could get my hands on a sausage and egg McMuffin.
Well, strangely enough, as you say, he's kind of got a bit of humour, whether it was him or whether it was an intern who obviously was on his Twitter. But the other interesting thing is he's not appearing to be biting in terms of this postal votes delay story, which now has kind of spread south a bit. Obviously, it was a big deal in Scotland, a few days ago, it looked like there was a significant number of people who hadn't got their postal votes, and obviously with the school summer holidays up here, they were going away. And but it appears that there's now areas down in England where similar things look like they're happening. The Royal Mail are obviously saying it's nothing to do with us. I mean, I wonder, when you actually look at some of the numbers that are now involved, I mean, the people that have, for example, Glasgow, probably the biggest council, have only had 170 people actually claiming that they haven't received their postal vote. So, I mean, how much of a big deal is this likely to be? I mean, Rishi obviously doesn't think it is. He's not making any kind of political point about that. It clearly is, I think, in some quarters of the SNP. Is this going to make a significant difference, or are we talking small numbers?
I mean, I think it's difficult to. We could do with a bit more detail in this story, couldn't we? What we need to know is exactly how many people haven't got their postal vote through and aren't going to be able to vote. If it is, if you're talking about a few dozen votes in different constituencies, then while it being, unacceptable, those people have been disenfranchised, it's clearly not going to make a big difference. But if it was the case that you're talking about hundreds of votes spread across that are in total in numbers of constituencies, then there's lots of very close Scottish constituencies where that's the sort of numbers of votes that are possibly going to swing who gets in. So I think the reason that there's a bit more resonance in Scotland is because of the fact that this election's been called in the middle of holidays anyway, which would have meant that there would have been a higher reliance on postal votes anyway. And we could do with a bit more detail on just how many people are impacted at the moment. They're kind of relying on different local authorities, giving a estimate. If it is the case that there's not that many people affected, then we could do with getting to the bottom of it, but it's not going to change the outcome. I don't think it's going to change the outcome overall anyway, obviously, but there are some very close constituencies in Scotland. It would be a great shame if there's, people aren't getting to vote.
I mean, I've got to say, if I was postal voting and hadn't received my postal vote, I would be absolutely fuming. So I completely understand why people feel disenfranchised. And to be honest, it's not a great look that in a modern democracy, somebody is being denied the right to vote because a piece of card never get delivered to them. But I've got to agree with John. I don't think it's going to change the outcome. Even though we do have tight seats, you've got to assume that the people who are, haven't been sent a postal vote is, it might be a representative sample of the Scottish population. So it's probably going to impact every party roughly the same. I was a bit surprised that Rishi Sunak didn't make a bigger deal about it, because I think, I think the Tories would probably, stand to suffer most from a lack of postal voting, because you look at the type of people who will probably be postal voting. We know in Scotland, over 70s are more likely to vote Tory than any other party. Without wanting to kind of make sweeping generalisations, but people that can afford to go on holiday are more likely, or not more likely, but there's a better chance than that. I've never really bought into the whole school, it's in the school holidays, that's a disgrace. I've never really bought into that narrative, because postal voting is now an option, and people go on holiday right through the year these days. I understand, obviously, it is the school holidays, but there have been people who were on holiday in 2019, during the election. We live in a world where the calendar's not as set as it used to be. But I can completely understand the anger from people who do feel that their voice isn't going to be heard, and of course it will raise a whole new debate about postal voting, which is already pretty controversial in some quarters. We've seen we've seen Donald Trump supporters in America aren't very, aren't massive fans of postal voting. So it's interesting to see if, something would, a debate like that could kind of.
I think it has brought out a few conspiracy theorists that, obviously depending upon, your political colours, what's going on. I mean, it's the bigger issue, not come Friday morning, probably going to be the numbers who didn't vote at all. And, is that not going to be the story? Because I suspect that is going to be in far greater numbers than the people who didn't get a chance to get their postal vote.
I mean, I done a wee deep dive on the most recent poll this morning. Fun enough, I was looking at that, the More in Common poll that came out yesterday morning. And when you look at the raw data rather than the kind of headline figures, 14% of those polled weren't going to bother voting. Now, we're talking about 500,000 people right now aren't even going to bother. They've had enough. What it also showed is, 9% of people still haven't decided. They might be planning on voting. So there could yet be 350,000 votes up for grabs over the next 24 hours, which shows that a lot of these knife-edge seats could yet shift. And I suspect that number dwarfs those, who don't have their postal vote. Ultimately, there's still a massive disconnect. The same poll showed Keir Starmer was the most popular politician in Scotland, but even he had a negative rating. Not a single public figure, people were asked about had a positive rating with the public. It's quite a depressing situation, and that'll reignite. I know some countries it's kind of seen as your civic duty, and you've got to have some form of, you've got to make your voice heard some way. I wonder if that might reignite, kind of mandatory voting calls. You've got to at least send something back or do something. None of the above.
Yeah, John. I mean, do you think that this trend is going to? I mean, certainly in the last few years, obviously we haven't had a general election for 5, but voting across, whether it's in Holyrood or whatever, it's all going down. So it is that, have people completely and utterly lost all trust in politicians?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's probably the biggest single thing that could completely change the face of politics in the UK is if that, say, 30 to 40% of the electorate who just won't bother voting were to actually get out and vote. I mean, if you think about it, the people who don't vote there's obviously going to be loads of variations, but in general, people who don't vote tend to be younger people and people on lower incomes. Rich, old people vote. So it's no surprise that we tend to have governments that help older, richer people in their lives more than younger, poorer people. So there's this apathy and feeling among young people that what's the point, because you don't seem to get a government that represents you anyway. Well, perhaps if all of those people got out and voted, it would change things. I
don't think it's just young people, John. I mean, I think there's an awful lot of older people as well who are completely disenfranchised.
Yeah, at every level, there are people that don't vote, but there is a greater percentage of younger people that don't tend to. And as you move up the income scale, you tend to, I mean, old people by and large do vote, and that's why you have things like the triple lock in pensions and to help with fuel bills, all these things that governments know that is a very motivated part of the electorate, and they will shift their vote depending on who's going to do things that help them. And there's a lesson there to be learned for younger generations. There has been a few times, the Scottish referendum, there was a very big turnout for that because there was this idea that this was a momentous thing which could lead to real change. First time around, actually, there was a I think quite a large increase in vote when Jeremy Corbyn was running, and he was standing in this platform of real radical change and redistribution of wealth. So if there is a very low turnout of this election, I think that will probably be a reflection of this idea that Labour and the Conservatives, although really Labour are going to win, it's a choice between them and the Conservatives, and it's difficult really to see the difference between the two parties. I don't think that's entirely fair, but I think that's the way it's viewed by many people.
I don't think talk of super majorities is helping encourage people to vote. There is very much a feeling that this is a foregone conclusion, but of course, that ironically could be the one thing that might scupper things for Labour on Thursday, is quite simply if people don't come out and vote them.
I mean, we have been here before. Remember, God, I've forgotten the year, but Kinnock. I mean, remember all the polls, 92, that's it. All the polls, everything suggested that he was going to win, and it flipped. And I mean, it's rare. We know it's rare that we get things wrong, but it's still possible. And of course, the other fly that we've got in the ointment at the moment is Reform, who are definitely bringing the headlines. We've got another Reform candidate that's defected to the Tories down south, citing bigotry. Others have been dropped by the party. And the Deputy Reform leader, Richard Tice, has called them Tory Trojan horses. And of course, in Scotland, it's now emerged that the party's Orkney and Shetland candidate, Robert Smith, in old social media posts, said that ex-First Minister Nicola Sturgeon should be shot. Reform have called that a mistake. But should really we be surprised about accusations that this party are racist and right-wing? Douglas?
No. I mean, Reform should be treated as a joke, frankly. But at the same time...
Why aren't they then, Douglas? Why aren't they?
Because they obviously represent a section of people who feel disenfranchised, who feel detached from politics, who are scared of the way the world's going or how they perceive the world is going. I played in a golf tournament on Sunday, and I was speaking to my playing partners and was amazed to hear all three of them speak up Reform. They were talking them up because they stay in East Kilbride, and as they see it, East Kilbride has become, and this is, just to emphasise, this is their words, not mine. They have, East Kilbride has become a dumping ground for asylum seekers, and they see people in the city centre who they maybe don't. I'm trying to think a way to word this, but they don't. They've come here from elsewhere, and to them, rightly or wrongly, they believe that the people who've come here are getting freebies from the government, and they're getting, nice houses, and they're getting this, that, and the next thing. And these are bright guys. These aren't, idiots, but they've got concerns over, the level of immigration coming to this country. And if you've got concern over immigration, Nigel Farage speaks to you. Now, and I think there's a kind of political bubble among the chattering classes who kind of talk down to people like that rather than talk to them. And they're kind of dismissed as racists, and they're dismissed as bigots rather than having their fears addressed. And it was that kind of attitude that led to the Brexit vote, in 2016, because the political establishment, as it was seen, were kind of talking down to folk who, and they were talking down to folk who had imaginary concerns about the EU, but they were talking down to folk who had genuine concerns about the EU as well. And what Reform are doing is, similar to what the SNP offered in 2014, similar to what the Leave campaign offered in 2016. They're offering easy solutions, and they're offering scapegoats to people who feel left behind by society's problems. So it's very easy to dismiss reform as cranks, which they are, and people absolutely should not vote reform on Thursday in Scotland. From a Scottish Daily Express point of view, all you're going to do is you're going to hand seats that the Tories could win to the SNP. But I think it's really dangerous to just dismiss them, and I think the more they're dismissed, then the stronger they'll become. And what you're seeing now is they have kind of cobbled together their roster, I suppose, and they haven't really vetted them. It's no great surprise that these type of people are attracted to reform, but I think it would be dangerous and wrong to assume that everyone who supports reform or potentially could support reform is the same.
John, are we seeing what Douglas has just described is obviously, you only have to look at France currently to see that as well. Are these people being ignored by, parties, dismissed or not given that voice? They're not being heard, or they're not feeling as if anybody's listening to them. And is that why we're seeing this?
Yeah, I think you would underestimate reform at your peril. They are potentially going to be a real force in British politics. There's a very good chance that should they get in with a number of MPs and the Conservative Party are decimated, that you could see some sort of amalgamation, or you could see Conservative MPs defecting to reform, or vice versa, some kind of amalgamation between reform and the Conservative Party, potentially with Nigel Farage at the helm. And that's, I don't think, a good thing for Britain, but you've really got to look and try and understand what the reasons for that are. It's essentially the sort of Liz Truss wing of the Conservative Party. It's people who believe that there's that globalisation is working against us, that immigration's out of control and only working for big corporations that want a cheap workforce in the UK, and don't care about all of the other social issues that are going to come with uncontrolled migration. So that there is, it would be a very bad thing to underestimate just how many people there are that feel that these issues aren't being addressed by the established party and that are going to vote for reform unless the other parties kind of try to understand these concerns and do something about them as well. Now, it seems really odd that you've got these candidates who are suddenly saying, I didn't realise that this party whose central policy is stopping foreigners coming into the UK, I didn't realise that they were a bit racist and xenophobic. It's pretty difficult to see how you could only have realised that now, a few days before the election. The Richard Tice and Nigel Farage are suggesting that these people are plants, that they're all actors that have been placed in the party as candidates in order to defect a few days before the election and bring down their overall chances. There's no evidence of that either way, but I think we need to disregard it as a possibility until there is some evidence. But I think that there's still, Nigel Farage is probably going to win a seat, and if there are a number of other Reform MPs that enter Parliament and the Tories are greatly reduced, then things are going to start happening at Westminster that could potentially be very bad, and everybody needs to wake up to that possibility and try to start making, for example, the positive argument for immigration, trying to point out that actually a lot of the problems we've got now in terms of the woeful lack of investment in Britain and actually the levels of immigration are because of Brexit, not the opposite. People need to actually try to understand these things and explain them, or else reform are going to fill this vacuum and grow in some form or another.
I think it's very easy to sneer at reform up here, and just to emphasise, for some of our candidates are nuts, right? I mean, it's absolutely, let's be honest here, it's off the charts. But in terms of their supporters, it's very easy in Scotland to sneer at them, because ultimately, these small boats are arriving in Dover, they're not arriving in Dunbar. This is something that seems quite remote to us up here. But I think if you did live in the south coast of England, it's a daily issue, and so it's easy to see why they are kind of gaining support in parts of the country. I think we've got quite a self-delusional idea of ourselves as being much more welcoming, than other parts of the UK.
I agree with you. I think there's lots of rhetoric around that, but it doesn't actually exist.
Just at the surface, I don't think it's too different. But up here, we don't, the population makeup of Scotland is very different than the population makeup of England. Now, quite different. And I think if you did stay in some of these areas, then you might, you would maybe see reform support rise even in Scotland. If we face some of the same issues and maybe facing in England, but people kind of dismiss, especially up here, anyone who kind of raises concerns about that. Although ultimately up here, public services aren't creaking because of immigration up here, but they may well be, parts of England where that is the case, and I think reform speaks to these people, and ultimately that's why they're polling well.
It'll be interesting. That will be another story, reform itself, on Friday morning, when we see just how many votes they're polling, as much as who will be in number 10. Douglas, John, thanks very much for joining me on Planet Holyrood, which you can watch on the Daily Record YouTube channel and you can listen to on Spotify. See you tomorrow.
It's important we look at the facts. Politics has to be about service.
A modern form of national service.
The outcome, that's for the voters to decide.